My social worker, Jennifer, told me it was a temporary placement, but even then, I knew that wasn't true. My mom wasn't coming back for me. She barely managed to keep the apartment clean or show up for her court dates. I had spent the last year pretending things were fine, but they weren't. Jennifer was quiet most of the drive. She tried to make small talk, asking me what kind of music I liked or if I had any hobbies. I gave short answers. I didn't feel like talking to her or anyone. When we pulled up to the house, I stared at it through the car window. It was smaller than I expected, a little run down, but the lawn was neat and the front door was painted a bright red. Jennifer smiled at me and said something about how it was a nice home, but I wasn't convinced. Linda, my foster mom, opened the door before we even knocked. She hugged Jennifer like they were old friends, then turned to me. "You must be Caitlin," she said. "Come in, sweetheart." The inside of the house smelled like lemon cleaner. There was a hallway that led straight to the kitchen, with a staircase on the left and a living room on the right. I remember thinking it wasn't as bad as some of the places my mom and I had stayed. There were 3 other kids living there. Hannah was around my age, maybe 16. Then there was Ryan, who was maybe 12, and Max, who was only 6. Max didn't say anything when Linda introduced him. He just stared at me and held onto her skirt like he was glued there. Linda showed me to my room upstairs. It was small. She said something about how I could decorate it however I wanted. But I didn't answer. I just put my bag on the bed and waited for her to leave. That first night I ate dinner with everyone at the table. Linda asked me questions about school and my favorite foods, but I kept my answers short. Robert, the foster dad, didn't talk much. He mostly sat at the head of the table, chewing slowly and watching everyone like he was waiting for something. After dinner, Linda said it was time for prayers. Everyone stood in a circle in the living room, holding hands. I didn't want to, but I didn't feel like I could say no. Linda said a prayer that went on longer than I thought it would. She thanked God for bringing me into their home and for keeping their family safe. Her voice was soft, but there was something about it that made me uncomfortable. That night, lying in bed, I tried to tell myself it wasn't so bad. The bed was clean, the house was quiet, and nobody yelled. But something about the way the other kids acted stuck with me. They didn't look scared exactly, but there was something wrong. Like they were all waiting for something. The next morning, Linda woke me up early for breakfast. The other kids were already at the table, eating silently. Robert sat at the head, flipping through a newspaper. Linda placed a bowl of oatmeal in front of me and said something about how structure was important for everyone in the house. After breakfast, Linda handed me a list of chores. I was supposed to dust the shelves, sweep the porch, and help Ryan fold laundry. She gave me an apron, and even though it made me uncomfortable, I tied it on without saying anything. Ryan didn't talk much while we worked. He folded the clothes like he'd done it 100 times before. When I asked him how long he'd been here, he shrugged. "Do they always give you this much to do?" "It's better if you just do it," he said without looking up. When I was dusting the bookshelves later, I found a stack of old leather-bound books tucked away in the corner. They didn't have titles. When I opened one, I couldn't understand the writing. The letters looked rough and uneven, almost like they'd been scratched into the page. "What are you doing?" Linda's voice came from behind me. I turned around, startled. She was standing in the doorway, watching me. I said I was cleaning, and she walked over, taking the book from my hands. "These aren't for you," she said, putting it back. Her tone stayed calm. but something about the way she stood made me uneasy. At dinner, Linda talked like she always did, asking the kids about their day and commenting on little things. Robert stayed quiet for most of the meal, but I noticed him watching me, just glancing over like he was waiting for something. When we did the nightly prayers, Linda's grip on my hand was stronger. She said the same words as before, thanking God for bringing me to their family. But it felt like she meant something else entirely. That night, I couldn't fall asleep. The house was silent except for the clock ticking somewhere in the hall. Just after midnight, I heard soft footsteps outside my door. They stopped, paused for a long moment, and then moved away. I stayed in bed and didn't open the door. The next morning, Linda asked me to help her in the garden after breakfast. The other kids had already gone, so it was just the two of us. She handed me gloves and pointed at the flower beds, saying the weeds had gotten out of control. I kept my head down, pulling weeds and trying not to think too much. Linda worked beside me, occasionally pointing out which plants I shouldn't touch. At one point, she said I seemed to be settling in well. Then she added something about how important it was to follow the rules and do your part. I nodded and kept working. After the garden, Linda sent me to clean the windows downstairs. While I was scrubbing the outside of the living room window, I noticed Robert standing inside watching me. He didn't move, just stood there with his arms crossed. Later, I went into the kitchen, where Hannah was setting the table for lunch. She was focused on the plates, not looking up. I asked if she needed help, and she said no, quick and sharp like she wanted me gone. I lowered my voice and asked if Robert always stared like that. She didn't answer right away, but glanced toward the living room before saying, "You get used to it." That was all she said, and then she went back to the table. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about the book I'd seen. After everyone had gone to bed and the house was quiet, I crept downstairs. The floorboards creaked under my feet, and I froze every few steps, listening for movement. The books were still there, tucked into the corner of the shelf. I grabbed the one I'd seen before and opened it again. The pages felt thick and rough, and the symbols in the margins caught my attention. They looked like the carvings on the back of my closet door, but more detailed. I didn't hear Robert until he was right behind me. He asked what I thought I was doing. I turned around fast, clutching the book like that would make it less obvious. He stepped forward and took it out of my hands, then looked at me for what felt like forever. He told me to go to bed. I didn't argue. When I got back to my room, I saw the carving on the back of the closet door. It looked like someone had traced over it with something sharp, making the lines deeper and fresher than they were before. At breakfast, I kept waiting for Linda or Robert to say something about the night before, but nobody said anything. Linda asked Hannah to help with the dishes and told Ryan to tidy up the hallway closet. Max sat quietly, staring at his oatmeal without eating it. After, Linda told me to clean the basement stairs. She handed me a bucket and a scrub brush and said I should make sure they were spotless. I didn't argue, just took the bucket and headed to the basement door. The stairs were narrow, and it got colder the farther down I went. It smelled damp and sour, like old concrete. There was only one light, a bare bulb hanging over the stairs, and it didn't reach the bottom. I started scrubbing. The water turned reddish as I worked, like something had stained the wood. I told myself it was just rust from the nails, or dirt tracked in from shoes. When I got to the bottom step, I noticed the door to the basement was open a little. It must have been like that the whole time, but I hadn't seen it before. I leaned in without thinking. There were shelves along the walls, lined with glass jars. Some were filled with dark liquid, and some had things floating inside, like clumps of something. I stepped back too fast and knocked over the bucket. Dirty water spilled down the stairs. I heard Robert's voice from upstairs, asking if everything was all right. I stood there for a second, staring at the jars, and said yes, I was fine. I didn't go back into the basement after that. When I brought the bucket up, Linda just told me to leave it by the sink. The rest of the day felt long. Hannah avoided me, and Ryan stayed in his room. Even Max didn't follow Linda around like he usually did. I wanted to ask Hannah about the jars, but she wouldn't look at me, so I didn't. That night, after prayers, I stayed awake again. I could hear creaking downstairs like someone walking. There was a scraping sound, and then it stopped. I thought about going to check, but I was scared. The next day, Linda didn't ask me to do any chores. She just said I should stay upstairs and rest. That's how she put it, rest. I wasn't sure if it was supposed to be a punishment or if she actually thought I looked tired. Either way, I didn't argue. I stayed in my room most of the morning listening to the noises in the house. At one point, I heard Robert talking to Max in the hallway. I couldn't make out everything, but it sounded like he was telling him to be brave. Max didn't say anything back. Later, I saw Hannah sitting on the edge of her bed when I passed her room. She was staring down at her hands, not moving. I stopped in the doorway and asked if she was okay. She didn't look up, just said I should mind my own business and go back to my room. By the time dinner rolled around, it felt like everyone was avoiding each other. Even Linda and Robert barely spoke. Max picked at his food, and when Linda told him to eat, he shook his head. She didn't push him, which surprised me. After dinner, I went back to my room. I didn't want to be around them anymore. I kept thinking about the jars in the basement. The house got quiet again after prayers. I stayed in bed, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the noises to start. A little after midnight, I heard footsteps outside my door. They were slower this time. Then there was a knock. I didn't move. The knock came again, louder. I sat up, my heart pounding, and whispered, asking who it was. No one answered. The handle turned, and the door opened just enough for me to see someone standing there. It was Max. He looked at me, wide-eyed, and whispered that they were going to take him downstairs. I didn't know what to say. He kept staring at me, like he was waiting for me to do something. Then I heard Linda's voice from the hall, calm and quiet, telling Max to come back. He didn't argue. He just turned around and followed her. I sat there for a long time after the door closed, trying to convince myself it wasn't as bad as it seemed, that maybe I was overthinking it, but I didn't believe that. The next morning, Max wasn't at breakfast. Linda didn't mention him, and neither did anyone else. It was like he'd never been there. I thought about asking where he was, but the words got stuck. Every time I looked at Linda, I remembered how calm she'd sounded in the hallway the night before, like it was no big deal. I went back to my room. I wasn't sure what else to do. The day passed slowly. I stayed in my room for most of it, trying to keep my mind from spiraling. I thought about calling Jennifer, my social worker, but what would I even say? That my foster parents were creepy and I didn't like the way they acted? It didn't sound like enough. By the time dinner came around, I was sure Max wouldn't be there. But when I sat down, there he was, sitting in his usual spot. He looked different, though. His face was pale, and his hands stayed in his lap the whole time, even when Linda told him to eat. He didn't look up or say anything. Linda acted like nothing was wrong. Robert didn't say much, but that wasn't unusual. When dinner was over, Linda said it was time for prayers. Max stood up slowly, like it took effort, and followed us into the living room. During the prayer, Linda thanked God for keeping the family safe and strong. She said something about forgiveness, but her voice didn't sound the way it usually did. It was softer, almost like she was talking to herself. Afterward, Max went straight to his room without a word. I wanted to follow him, but Linda told me to stay behind and help clear the table. When I finally got upstairs, Max's door was shut. I stood there for a minute, wondering if I should knock, but I didn't. That night, I lay awake again, listening to the sounds of the house. I heard the usual creaking and the clock ticking in the hallway. Around midnight, I heard footsteps again. This time, they didn't stop outside my door. They went straight past, down the hall, and stopped in front of Max's room. I sat up, holding my breath, and waited. There was a soft knock, and then the door opened. The footsteps moved inside, and then everything went quiet. The next morning, I waited by my door for a while before going downstairs. I thought maybe I'd hear something, but it was silent. When I finally went to the kitchen, Linda was at the stove, making eggs. Robert was at the table, drinking coffee and reading the paper like always. Hannah and Ryan were already sitting down. Max wasn't there. Linda didn't say anything about him. Neither did anyone else. I sat down, and she put a plate in front of me without a word. I picked at it, trying to figure out what to do. I wanted to ask where Max was, but the way everyone acted made it clear I shouldn't. After breakfast, Linda told me to clean the hallway mirror. She handed me a cloth and a bottle of glass cleaner, then walked off without waiting for a response. The mirror was just outside Max's room. When I got there, I stood for a minute, staring at his closed door. I couldn't hear anything from inside. I cleaned the mirror slowly, glancing at the door every few seconds. Finally, I couldn't help it. I reached for the handle. It turned easily, and the door swung open. The room was empty. His bed was made, and his things were gone. The little toy car he'd been playing with on the first day I got here wasn't on the windowsill anymore. It didn't even look like anyone had been staying there. I closed the door and went back to cleaning. Later, when I saw Hannah in the hallway, I asked if she knew what happened to Max. She stopped walking and stared at me for a long time, like she was deciding whether to answer. "They take people downstairs sometimes," she finally said. Her voice was so quiet I almost didn't catch it. I asked what she meant, but she just shook her head and walked away. That night, I couldn't sit through prayers. When Linda reached for my hand, I said I wasn't feeling well and went to my room. She didn't argue, but the way she looked at me made my stomach twist. I locked my door for the first time since I got there. I sat on the bed, listening to the sounds of the house, trying to tell myself that Max was okay, that maybe he got moved to another foster home and no one thought to tell me. But I didn't believe that. The footsteps started again around midnight. They moved down the hall, pausing in front of my door. I stayed perfectly still, staring at the lock, willing it to hold. After a few seconds, the footsteps moved on. When I finally fell asleep, I dreamed about the jars in the basement. The day after Max's room was emptied, Linda told me to help her organize the pantry. She didn't ask, just handed me a list and told me where to start. Her tone was sharp, and for the first time since I got there, she didn't call me sweetheart. The pantry was cramped and smelled stale, like old spices. I worked in silence while she stood behind me, folding paper bags into neat stacks. Max went to stay with another family, she said suddenly, her voice flat. I didn't respond. He's where he's supposed to be now, she added. That made me stop. I turned to look at her, but she was focused on the bags, smoothing out the creases. Her expression was blank. I wanted to ask what she meant, but something in the way she stood made it clear I shouldn't. Later, when I saw Hannah in the hallway, I tried again. I asked if she really thought Max was with another family. She looked at me for a second, then said that if I kept asking questions, I'd end up just like him. That night, I stayed awake again, waiting for the footsteps. I wasn't sure if I was more scared of hearing them or of not hearing them at all. Around midnight, they started. The slow, heavy steps moved past my door and down the hall, stopping again outside Max's old room. Then I heard something else. It sounded like the basement door opening. I got out of bed before I could talk myself out of it. I cracked open my door just enough to see the hallway. There was no one there, but I could hear muffled voices coming from downstairs. I didn't want to go, but I couldn't stop myself. I stepped into the hall and made my way to the stairs, keeping my hands against the wall to stay steady. When I reached the top of the basement stairs, I froze. The door was open, and the light inside was dim. I could hear Linda and Robert talking, their voices low and rhythmic, almost like they were chanting. I stood there for what felt like forever, trying to decide what to do. Then the chanting stopped. I turned to go back to my room, but the stairs creaked under my weight. The basement went silent. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I ran back to my room, slammed the door, and locked it. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. I could hear footsteps coming up the stairs, moving faster now, and then they stopped outside my door. Linda's voice was calm, almost sweet. She said I needed to open the door. I stayed quiet, pressed against the wall, trying not to breathe. After a minute, she said it again, still calm, but firmer this time. When I didn't answer, the doorknob rattled, and then the footsteps moved away. I didn't sleep after that. The footsteps came earlier that night. I sat on my bed, staring at the lock, when I heard them in the hallway. They moved slowly, dragging against the floor like someone was being pulled. Then the basement door opened. I don't know what I was thinking. Maybe I just needed to know for sure. I got up, opened my door, and crept into the hallway. The air felt colder as I moved toward the basement, like the warmth had been sucked out of the house. The door was ajar, and I could see the light spilling up the stairs. Shadows moved across the walls, shifting with the flickering of candles below. I stepped down carefully, pressing my hand against the wall to keep from falling. The voices started low but grew louder as I got closer. It wasn't English. It wasn't even a language I recognized. The sounds were guttural, sharp in places, and dragged out in others, like they were being stretched. When I reached the bottom of the stairs, I froze. The room was bigger than I thought. The walls were lined with shelves, crammed with jars of all sizes. Some of the jars were clear, filled with dark liquid that clung to the glass when the candlelight hit it. Inside, I could see things floating, small, shriveled shapes with twisted limbs. I looked away, but my eyes kept finding them again. In the center of the room was a table. Ryan was lying on it, his arms and legs tied down with thick knotted ropes. His shirt had been torn open, and his chest was smeared with something dark and shiny. His eyes were open, staring at the ceiling, but he didn't blink or move. Linda stood over him, holding a knife in one hand and a bowl in the other. The knife wasn't like anything I'd seen before. It was curved, with jagged edges, and the metal looked almost black. She was muttering something under her breath, her voice rising and falling in a rhythm that made my stomach churn. Robert stood beside her, holding a long, thin candle. He wasn't watching Ryan. He was watching the shelves, staring at the jars like he was waiting for something to happen. I wanted to run, but I couldn't. My feet wouldn't move. Linda dipped her fingers into the bowl and smeared something across Ryan's forehead. It was red, thick, and sticky. I realized it wasn't paint. She raised the knife. Her voice grew louder, the words coming faster, tumbling over each other. The candlelight made her shadow stretch across the walls, huge and warped. Ryan's lips moved, like he was trying to say something. That was when I stepped back, and the stair creaked under my weight. Linda's head snapped up, her eyes locking on mine. For a second, everything stopped. Her face twisted into something I'd never seen before. Her mouth pulled back too far, and her eyes looked almost black in the candlelight. She screamed my name, the sound sharp and raw, and lunged toward me. I turned and ran, taking the stairs 2 at a time. My legs felt like they were on fire, but I didn't stop. Behind me, I could hear her yelling, her footsteps pounding up the stairs. When I reached the front door, I fumbled with the lock, my hands shaking so hard I could barely get it open. I didn't look back as I ran outside, but I could still hear her voice. It wasn't yelling anymore. It was chanting again, louder this time, like she wasn't talking to me but to someone else. The last thing I heard before the door slammed shut was Ryan's voice, soft and broken, calling for help. I didn't stop running until I found a gas station. The man behind the counter gave me a strange look when I stumbled in, barefoot and shaking, but he didn't ask any questions. He just handed me his phone and told me to call someone. When the police showed up, I told them everything. About the jars, the chanting, the basement. They didn't say much, just nodded and asked if I had somewhere safe to go. They drove me to a shelter. I spent the night curled up on a cot, staring at the ceiling, waiting for Linda or Robert to burst through the door. But they didn't. The next day, a social worker came to see me. She said the police went to the house, but no one was there. The basement was empty. No shelves, no candles, no jars. She said it was probably a misunderstanding, that maybe the family had decided to leave in a hurry. I didn't argue. A week later, I saw the news. The headline said something about foster children missing under suspicious circumstances. There was a picture of Linda and Robert. The article said they'd taken in more than a dozen kids over the years. Most of them were never heard from again. They didn't mention Ryan or Max. I stared at the screen until my eyes burned, waiting for something to make sense. But it never did.